The mirror doesn't lie.
Marcus stared at his reflection in the gym bathroom, water dripping from his hands onto the cracked tile floor.
Sweat outlined his shirt in dark patches.
His breathing came heavy, ragged. Not from the workout he'd just finished, but from something deeper. Something clawing at his chest.
"You're pathetic."
The words weren't his.
They belonged to his father.
15 years dead, but still talking.
Still cutting. Still right. Marcus gripped the sink edge until his knuckles went white.
The fluorescent light buzzed overhead like an angry wasp. In that harsh glare, every failure etched itself across his face.
The promotion that went to someone else. The woman who'd walked away without looking back.
The dreams he'd buried under excuses and cheap wine. He was 34 and still afraid of his own shadow. But something had shifted today. During those final reps on the bench press, when his muscles screamed and his mind begged him to quit, he'd pushed through.
Not because he was strong.
Because he was tired of being weak. The weak version of himself had to die.
Not metaphorically. Not eventually. Tonight.
Part 1: The Anatomy of Weakness. The weak man believes the world owes him something. He waits for permission, for the right moment, for someone else to validate his worth. He builds elaborate justifications for his inaction and calls them wisdom. He mistakes comfort for contentment and mediocrity for peace. Marcus had been that man for 3 decades.
It started early.
7 years old, hiding behind his mother's legs when strangers spoke to him. The teacher called it shyness. His father called it weakness.
Both were wrong.
It was strategy, a child's strategy for survival in a world that felt too big, too harsh, too ready to devour him whole. But survival strategies become prisons when you outgrow the threats that created them. He'd carried that hiding instinct into adulthood.
Behind politeness when he should have been direct. Behind maybe later when he meant absolutely not.
Behind self-deprecating humor when he should have stood tall and owned his space. The weak version of Marcus lived in constant negotiation with fear.
Every decision filtered through a simple question: what if I fail?
That question had cost him everything worth having.
The promotion went to Janet because she'd walked into the director's office and asked for it. Not hinted. Not waited to be noticed. Asked.
Demanded, really, in the polite but unmistakable way that successful people communicate their value.
Marcus had done the work.
Hell, he'd done Janet's work half the time, covering her mistakes and filling in her knowledge gaps. But Janet had done something more important. She'd acted like someone who deserved the promotion.
"I'm not ready yet," he'd told himself. "I need more experience. More credentials. More certainty. More excuses."
Sarah had left him for the same reason, though she'd been kinder about it.
"You're a good man, Marcus. But I need someone who knows what he wants. Someone who fights for it."
She'd found that someone within 6 months. They were engaged now. Marcus had spent 2 years analyzing what went wrong, dissecting their relationship like a failed science experiment. The truth was simpler than his theories. She'd fallen in love with his potential, then grown tired of waiting for him to claim it. The weak version of himself had watched her leave.
Had nodded understanding.
Had even wished her well, because confrontation felt impossible and dignity seemed like the consolation prize.
But dignity without action isn't dignity. It's resignation wearing a fancy name. The gym became his laboratory.
Not for building muscle, though that happened too, but for studying the difference between weakness and strength.
Weakness wasn't physical.
The strongest man in the gym, a powerlifter named Rodriguez, spent most conversations apologizing for taking up space. He could deadlift 400 pounds but couldn't ask the front desk to turn down music that was giving him a headache.
Strength wasn't about dominance either.
The loudest guy in the weight room, always dropping plates and grunting for attention, got visibly nervous when anyone challenged his form or questioned his advice. He performed strength but didn't possess it. True strength, Marcus realized, was something else entirely. It lived in the woman who asked Rodriguez to spot her on a lift she'd never attempted before. In the older man who corrected the loud guy's dangerous squat form without raising his voice or offering apologies. In the trainer who said no when clients wanted shortcuts that would hurt their progress. Strength was the willingness to be uncomfortable in service of something larger than comfort. The weak version of Marcus had built his entire life around avoiding discomfort.
Every choice designed to minimize friction, conflict, disappointment.
He'd optimized for emotional safety and achieved emotional numbness instead. Safety, he learned, was the most dangerous illusion of all. Rodriguez approached him after a particularly brutal leg workout. Marcus was slumped against the wall, legs shaking from exertion. "You're getting stronger," Rodriguez said.
No preamble. No small talk. "Thanks. Still got a long way to go."
Rodriguez tilted his head. "That's weak man talk." The words hit like a slap. Marcus started to deflect, to laugh it off, to minimize the comment.
Instead, something new spoke up.
Something that had been growing in the space between his ribs during those punishing workouts.
"What do you mean? You just did something most people can't. Something you couldn't do last month.
But, instead of owning it, you immediately pointed to what you're lacking."
"Why?" Marcus opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "I don't want to seem arrogant. Whose opinion are you protecting?" The question landed like a body shot. Whose opinion was he protecting? The strangers who didn't know his journey? The people who hadn't shown up to do the work? The voices in his head that sounded suspiciously like everyone who'd ever made him feel small? Arrogance and confidence aren't the same thing, Rodriguez continued. Confident man says I did good work today. Arrogant man says I'm better than you.
Weak man says it wasn't that impressive because he's afraid of being either one. Rodriguez walked away before Marcus could respond.
Left him sitting there, leg muscles screaming, mind reeling. That night, Marcus made a list.
Everything he'd minimized, deflected, or apologized for in the past month. The list filled 3 pages. He'd apologized for asking a barista to remake his coffee when they'd gotten the order wrong. He'd downplayed his work contribution during a team meeting where he'd solved the core problem everyone else was dancing around. He'd laughed off a compliment about his weight loss instead of saying thank you. 3 pages of self-sabotage disguised as humility. The weak version of himself was like a malicious internal editor, constantly revising his reality to make him smaller, safer, more invisible. That editor had to be fired. But firing him would require becoming the kind of man who could deliver bad news without apology. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Evolution rarely does. It started with small rebellions against his own habits. Instead of automatically saying sorry when someone bumped into him, he said nothing. Instead of deflecting compliments, he said thank you. Instead of asking permission to speak in meetings, he spoke. The weak version of himself fought back. Hard. "Who do you think you are?" the familiar voice whispered. "People will think you're arrogant. Selfish. Too much." But another voice had emerged during those gym sessions. Stronger. Steadier. It sounded like Rodriguez, like the confident trainer, like every person he'd admired from a distance. "I think I'm someone worth listening to," he answered back. "Someone who has valuable contributions to make. Someone who deserves to take up space." The internal argument raged for weeks. Every confident action followed by a wave of anxiety. Every boundary set followed by guilt. Every success followed by the fear that he was becoming someone his loved ones wouldn't recognize. But the external results were undeniable. His project manager started asking for his input on decisions that didn't directly involve his team. Colleagues stopped interrupting him mid-sentence during presentations. The barista at his regular coffee shop started his order before he reached the counter and got it right every time. People responded to confidence like flowers respond to sunlight. They turned toward it, grew stronger in its presence, sought it out. The weak version of himself had been convinced that confidence was selfish, that taking up space meant taking space from others. But he was learning the opposite. His weakness didn't make room for anyone else to be strong. It just created a vacuum where leadership should have lived. 6 months into his transformation, Marcus faced his first real test. The department was restructuring. His boss had been promoted to regional director, creating an opening for someone to lead their team. The obvious choice was Janet. She'd gotten the last promotion, had seniority, played the political game better. But Marcus had been doing the actual strategic thinking. He'd identified the operational inefficiencies that were bleeding money. He'd designed the workflow improvements that had increased their output by 30%. He'd mentored 3 junior team members who were now outperforming people with twice their experience. The weak version of himself would have assumed Janet deserved the role. Would have convinced himself he wasn't ready yet. Would have waited for someone to notice his contributions and reward him without being asked. The strategic version asked himself different questions. Who could do the job better? Who had the vision to take the team where it needed to go? Who had earned the responsibility through results, not just relationships? The answers were uncomfortable but clear. Marcus requested a meeting with the regional director, his former boss, now 2 levels above him. The weak version of himself would have prepared elaborate justifications, apologetic framings, tentative suggestions. Instead, he prepared a case. "I want to discuss the team leadership position," he said, settling into the chair across from Director Chen's desk. No preamble. No apology for taking up his time. Chen raised an eyebrow. "I assumed you'd be supporting Janet's candidacy. Janet's good at managing relationships. I'm better at driving results." He laid out his contributions over the past year. Not humbly. Not with deflection or minimization. With the confidence of someone who'd done exceptional work and knew it. He presented his vision for the team's future. The strategic initiatives that would position them ahead of the industry curve. The talent development programs that would turn their junior members into leaders. The operational changes that would double their current efficiency gains. Chen listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, silence filled the room. "This is a different side of you," Chen said finally. "It's the side that's been doing the work while others were taking credit for it." More silence. Then, Chen leaned back in his chair. "Janet has been lobbying for this position for 3 weeks. Sent me detailed proposals, scheduled multiple meetings, even had lunch with my boss to discuss her vision. You just walked in here and laid out a better case in 15 minutes. Why didn't you do this sooner?" The honest answer would have been, because I was weak. Because I was afraid. Because I didn't believe I deserved it. But honesty about past weakness didn't serve his current strength. Because I was still building the track record to back up what I'm telling you now. Chen nodded slowly. "I'll make my decision by Friday." Marcus left that office knowing he'd crossed a line. There was no going back to being the person who waited for permission, who hoped someone else would recognize his worth, who confused humility with invisibility. He'd made himself a candidate. Now he had to live with the consequences. Part 2, the strategic mind emerges, the weak man reacts. The strategic man responds. The difference isn't semantic, it's the gap between being shaped by circumstances and shaping them in return. Marcus got the promotion. Janet didn't take it well. She'd expected the role, had already started making plans, had told her friends and family it was essentially guaranteed. When Chen announced Marcus's appointment during the Monday team meeting, her face went through a series of micro-expressions that would have made a poker player proud. Surprise. Anger. Something that looked almost like betrayal. The weak version of Marcus would have felt guilty. Would have sought her out afterward to apologize for pursuing something she wanted. Would have minimized his own achievement to make her feel better. The strategic version understood something more important: her disappointment wasn't his responsibility to manage. "Congratulations," Janet said after the meeting, her voice carefully neutral. "I guess the best man won." There was poison in the politeness. An invitation to guilt, to self-doubt, to making himself smaller so she could feel larger.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to working with you in this new capacity.
No apology. No minimization.
No acceptance of her emotional manipulation. She waited a beat, clearly expecting more. When nothing came, her professional mask slipped slightly.
I hope you're ready for this. Leadership isn't just about having good ideas.
The challenge was unmistakable. So was the opportunity to respond from weakness, to doubt himself, to seek her approval, to prove he was still the same harmless Marcus who wouldn't threaten her sense of superiority.
You're right. It's about making good ideas reality.
I'm looking forward to seeing what we can accomplish together.
Direct. Confident. Offering collaboration without begging for it. Janet's eyes narrowed.
She'd expected the old Marcus, the one she could manipulate with disappointment and veiled criticism. This version didn't fit her understanding of how their dynamic worked.
Well, she said after a moment. I guess we'll see.
She walked away without waiting for his response. The weak Marcus would have spent the rest of the day analyzing the interaction, second-guessing his responses, wondering if he'd been too harsh or too cold. The strategic Marcus filed it away as valuable information about the challenges ahead and turned his attention to more important things. Like building a team that could execute his vision. Leadership, Marcus discovered, was just applied strategic thinking at scale. The weak version of himself had believed leadership was about being liked, about keeping everyone happy, about consensus building and diplomatic solutions. He'd watched ineffective managers try to please everyone and succeed at pleasing no one.
True leadership was about clarity. About making decisions that served the mission instead of serving egos.
About being comfortable with the fact that not everyone would approve of your choices.
His first major decision involved the team's biggest underperformer. David had been with the company for 8 years. Nice guy. Well liked.
Completely incompetent at his core responsibilities but gifted at making his failures seem like bad luck or systemic problems. Previous managers had shuffled him between projects, hoping he'd find his fit. Marcus's predecessor had avoided the issue entirely, letting David coast while others picked up his slack. The weak version of Marcus would have done the same thing. Would have convinced himself that David just needed better guidance, more support, a different role that matched his strengths. The strategic version looked at the data.
David's project completion rate was 60% lower than team average.
His work quality required extensive revision from senior team members. His absence from the team would require exactly zero adjustment to their workflow because others were already doing his job.
David had to go.
But firing someone required a different kind of strength than Marcus had developed. Physical strength was about pushing through resistance. This was about causing deliberate, necessary pain to someone who didn't deserve it as a person but couldn't perform the role they'd been hired to fill. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. David, we need to discuss your performance trajectory and how it aligns with team objectives. David shifted in his chair. He'd had variations of this conversation before with other managers, had developed sophisticated deflection strategies. I know I've been struggling with the Henderson project, but that was really a scope issue, and the client kept changing requirements. I'm not here to relitigate specific projects. I'm here to discuss whether this role is the right fit for your skills and interests. The directness caught David off guard. Previous managers had let him lead these conversations, had allowed him to steer toward explanations and excuses.
What do you mean?
Your completion rate is significantly below team standards. Your work requires extensive revision from senior members. You seem frustrated by the role requirements. I think we should explore whether there's a better fit for you elsewhere in the company.
David's eyes widened. Are you firing me?
The weak version of Marcus would have hedged.
Would have made it about budget constraints or departmental restructuring or anything except David's performance.
I'm suggesting that we discuss a transition plan that serves both your career interests and team needs.
This is because of Janet, isn't it? She's been undermining me since you got promoted.
There it was.
The deflection.
The attempt to make this about politics instead of performance, to recruit Marcus into a narrative where David was the victim of office dynamics rather than his own professional shortcomings.
This is about results. Your results specifically. Marcus slid a folder across the table.
These are your metrics compared to team standards over the past 18 months. The pattern is clear and consistent. David flipped through the pages, his face cycling through emotions.
Denial. Anger. Something that might have been recognition. I can improve. Give me another chance. Set specific goals and I'll meet them.
The weak version of Marcus would have been moved by the plea. Would have convinced himself that compassion required giving David another opportunity to fail. The strategic version understood that compassion for one underperformer meant cruelty to everyone else who was carrying his load. I appreciate your willingness to improve, but the pattern suggests this isn't about effort.
It's about fit.
Let's focus on finding you a role where you can succeed instead of continuing to struggle here. The conversation ended with David agreeing to a voluntary transfer to a different department, one where his social skills and relationship management abilities would be better utilized.
Marcus felt sick for the rest of the day.
Not because he'd made the wrong decision. Because making the right decision had required becoming someone he didn't fully recognize yet. Someone who could cause pain in service of larger goals. Someone who could prioritize results over comfort. The weak version of himself had died a little more that day.
The team's response to David's departure revealed who Marcus was really working with.
Janet made pointed comments about new management approaches and changing company culture. Two of the junior team members, David's friends, grew noticeably cooler in their interactions with Marcus.
They'd liked David personally and couldn't separate that from his professional inadequacy.
But the senior team members started performing differently.
Projects moved faster without David's bottlenecks.
Quality improved without the need to revise his work. Most importantly, they began bringing more ambitious ideas to team meetings, as if they'd been waiting for someone willing to make hard decisions about execution.
You did the right thing, Rodriguez told him at the gym. But not everyone's going to thank you for it. I'm starting to understand that leadership isn't about being thanked. What's it about? Marcus considered the question while adjusting his grip on the barbell.
6 months ago, he would have given some textbook answer about serving others or building consensus. It's about being responsible for outcomes instead of being responsible for feelings.
Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Took me 15 years to figure that out. Cost me 2 businesses before I learned the difference.
That was the thing about strength, Marcus realized. It was expensive to develop, but more expensive to live without. The weak version of himself had paid for his weakness with missed opportunities, unfulfilled potential, and the slow erosion of his own self-respect. The strategic version would pay different prices.
Some people wouldn't like him. Some decisions would keep him awake at night. Some relationships wouldn't survive his commitment to excellence over comfort.
But those were fair trades for building something that mattered. 3 months into his leadership role, Marcus faced a crisis that would have broken his former self.
Their biggest client, representing 40% of the department's revenue, threatened to terminate their contract.
The complaint was legitimate. A project delivery had been delayed by 3 weeks, causing them to miss a critical market window. Their internal deadline pressure had cascaded to their customers, potentially costing millions in lost opportunity. The old Marcus would have panicked. Would have immediately started crafting apologies and explanations, would have promised anything to keep the client happy, would have thrown his team under the bus if necessary to preserve the relationship.
The strategic version asked different questions. What had actually gone wrong? What were the systemic issues that created this failure? How could they prevent it from happening again? And, most importantly, what would a solution look like that served everyone's long-term interests, not just their short-term fears?
The delay had occurred because Janet, managing the project timeline, had refused to acknowledge that their original deadline was unrealistic given the scope changes the client had requested. Instead of having an uncomfortable conversation about adjusting expectations, she'd pushed the team to work unsustainable hours trying to meet an impossible target. When they inevitably fell short, she'd hidden the extent of the problem until it was too late to course correct. The weak version of Marcus would have focused on managing the client's anger while quietly reassigning Janet to avoid future problems. The strategic version saw an opportunity to build something stronger from the crisis. He called a meeting with the client's leadership team. Not to apologize, though he would take responsibility, but to present a solution. The delivery failure reflects a breakdown in our project management process, he began. Specifically, our reluctance to have difficult conversations about realistic timelines when project scope changes.
The client's CEO, Richardson, leaned forward. Are you saying this is our fault for requesting changes?
I'm saying it's our fault for not communicating the timeline implications of those changes clearly. You had the right to know that your requests would affect the delivery date. We should have presented you with options instead of quietly trying to do the impossible. Richardson exchanged glances with his team. They'd clearly expected a different conversation, more defensiveness, more excuses, more pleading.
What are you proposing? Marcus slid a folder across the table. A new project management framework that builds timeline flexibility into every contract.
Clear communication protocols for scope changes. And, most importantly, a guarantee that we'll never again tell you something is possible when our data says it isn't. That's great for future projects.
What about the mess you've created with this one? Here was the moment that would define their relationship going forward. The weak version of Marcus would have offered discounts, free services, anything to make the immediate pain go away.
We're going to deliver the project at the quality level you contracted for, 3 weeks later than promised. Then, we're going to conduct a comprehensive review of what went wrong and share that analysis with your team. And, we're going to implement systemic changes to ensure this never happens again.
That's it? No compensation for our missed market window?
Richardson, your market window was always going to be compromised the moment you requested the scope changes. The only question was whether you'd know about it in advance so you could make informed decisions.
We failed to give you that information.
But, we can't compensate you for losses that were built into your decisions.
The room went quiet.
Marcus could feel his own heart pounding, but his voice stayed steady. What we can do is become the kind of partner who gives you accurate information so you can make better decisions going forward.
That's more valuable than any discount we could offer.
Richardson stared at him for a long moment.
You're not what I expected.
What did you expect?
Someone who would promise me the moon to keep our business. Would that have served your interests? Richardson actually laughed. No. But, most people don't seem to understand that.
They kept the contract. More importantly, they began using Marcus's framework as the model for their relationships with other vendors. But, the real victory happened 6 months later, when Richardson's company expanded and chose Marcus's team to lead their largest project to date. Not because they'd never failed, but because they'd failed responsibly and learned strategically. The weak version of himself could never have built that kind of relationship. It required being comfortable with disappointing people in the short term to serve them better in the long term.
It required strength.
Part 3, the strategic self as default operating system. Strength isn't something you achieve and, then, possess. It's something you choose, moment by moment, decision by decision, for the rest of your life. The weak self never fully dies. It evolves, adapts, finds new ways to whisper its familiar seductions.
The strategic self has to remain vigilant, has to choose strength even when it would be easier to retreat into old patterns. Especially then.
Marcus learned this during his first major romantic relationship since Sarah. Her name was Elena, and she challenged him in ways that revealed just how much work he still had to do. Elena was a successful architect who'd built her own firm from nothing. She was used to dealing with contractors, clients, and city bureaucrats who tried to diminish her authority because she was a woman in a male-dominated field.
She had zero patience for weakness disguised as sensitivity.
"You're different from most men I meet," she told him after their third date.
"You actually seem to know what you want." It was a compliment wrapped around a warning.
She'd dated plenty of men who'd seemed confident until they got comfortable, then, reverted to seeking her approval for every decision, every opinion, every choice. The weak version of Marcus would have heard that as pressure to perform strength rather than possess it. Would have tried to manage her impression of him instead of simply being the person he'd worked to become. But 6 months of strategic thinking had taught him something important: sustainable relationships required sustainable versions of yourself. You couldn't fake strength long enough to build anything real. So he didn't try to impress her. He just continued being the person he'd become: direct, decisive, comfortable with taking up space, willing to disagree when disagreement served the truth.
The test came 3 months into their relationship. Elena's firm was bidding on a major municipal project.
She'd spent weeks preparing her proposal, working 18-hour days, pouring her vision and expertise into every detail. 2 days before the submission deadline, she discovered that her main competitor had somehow obtained detailed information about her approach and was adapting his proposal to neutralize her advantages. She came to Marcus's apartment that night in a fury that barely contained her devastation.
Someone in my office leaked to Harrison's team.
Had to be someone with access to the full proposal.
Someone I trusted.
She paced his living room like a caged animal, her architect's mind cataloging the betrayal while her heart dealt with the implications.
I'm going to withdraw the bid.
I can't compete against my own ideas being used by someone with deeper pockets and better connections.
The weak version of Marcus would have immediately offered comfort.
Would have told her that everything would work out, that she was overreacting, that she should fight anyway because fairness would prevail.
The strategic version asked better questions. What would withdrawing accomplish? Elena stopped pacing. It would preserve some dignity. Show that I won't participate in a rigged game. Whose dignity are you preserving? Yours or theirs?
She stared at him.
What do you mean?
Harrison's team cheated because they couldn't beat your ideas honestly. You withdrawing validates their strategy and rewards their behavior.
It also tells everyone else in the industry that Elena Vasquez can be pushed out of competitions through underhanded tactics. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend this didn't happen? Submit a proposal I know they've already neutralized? Marcus sat down across from her.
You're supposed to do what you'd advise a client to do if someone was trying to steal their building project. You adapt, overcome, and demonstrate why your integrity is actually a competitive advantage.
Easy for you to say. It's not your career on the line.
The weak version of himself would have backed down at that challenge. Would have apologized for offering unwanted advice, would have switched to pure emotional support. The strategic version understood that real support sometimes required saying difficult things.
You're right. It's not my career. But it is your choice about what kind of architect and what kind of person you want to be.
Someone who quits when the game gets dirty, or someone who plays it better.
Elena's eyes flashed. Are you suggesting I should cheat too? I'm suggesting you should use your actual advantages instead of pretending this is about fairness.
Harrison's team stole your ideas, but they don't understand the thinking behind them.
They can copy your solutions without grasping your methodology.
You can adapt your approach in ways they can't anticipate because they don't actually understand what makes your work superior. Marcus stood up and moved to his whiteboard, a remnant from his strategic planning sessions with his work team.
What are the 3 things that make your firm different from Harrison's? Elena watched him for a long moment.
He could see her mind shifting gears, moving from emotional reaction to analytical problem solving.
We understand how people actually use spaces, not just how they look in photographs. We design for 20-year maintenance costs, not just construction costs.
And we integrate sustainability from the beginning instead of adding it as afterthoughts.
Marcus wrote those points on the board.
Harrison's team copied your aesthetic and your technical specifications.
Did they copy your user research methodology? They couldn't have. We spent months interviewing stakeholders, observing traffic patterns, studying how similar buildings actually function in practice.
So their proposal looks like yours but is based on assumptions instead of data.
Elena's posture changed. She was no longer pacing like a trapped animal.
She was standing like someone who just realized she was holding better cards than she'd thought.
What are you thinking?
I'm thinking I need to highlight the research foundation in ways that make it obvious they don't have equivalent data. Make the depth of our preparation become a competitive advantage they can't steal because they didn't do the work. Marcus capped the marker and turned back to her.
That's not fighting dirty. That's fighting smart. Elena looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before.
Something between respect and attraction, but deeper than either.
You didn't tell me everything would be okay. Because it might not be. You might lose the bid anyway.
But, if you do, it'll be because they had advantages you couldn't overcome, not because you gave up before the fight started.
She crossed the room and kissed him.
Not the kind of kiss that led to bedroom, but the kind that sealed understanding. I'm glad you're not who I thought you were when we first met.
What did you think I was? Safe. Comfortable. Someone who would never challenge me to be better than I already am.
The weak version of Marcus would have been hurt by that assessment. Would have seen being called safe as an insult to his masculinity.
The strategic version understood it as the highest compliment she could offer.
She was telling him that he'd grown beyond the need to manage her emotions and had developed the strength to serve her highest good instead.
Elena won the municipal contract.
Not because the game was fair, but because she'd played it with integrity and strategic intelligence. Harrison's team had her superficial solutions but none of her foundational understanding. When the selection committee asked detailed questions about implementation, the depth gap became obvious. More importantly, their relationship survived its first real stress test. Not because they'd avoided conflict, but because they'd navigated it with honesty and mutual respect for each other's strength. But the most profound transformation came not in Marcus's professional or romantic life, but in his relationship with his own father's memory. For 34 years, those words, "you're pathetic," had been the baseline against which he measured himself. Every achievement filtered through the certainty that his father would have found it insufficient. Every moment of confidence undermined by the voice that had never learned to offer encouragement. The weak version of Marcus had spent decades trying to prove that voice wrong through external validation. The strategic version realized the voice itself was irrelevant. It happened during a family gathering at his sister's house. His nephew Jake, 7 years old, was struggling with a puzzle that was clearly too advanced for him. Getting frustrated, throwing pieces, declaring himself stupid. Marcus watched his brother-in-law's response, "Don't be stupid, Jake.
Smart boys don't give up." The same dynamic. The same crushing of spirit disguised as motivation. The same cycle preparing to repeat itself in another generation.
The weak version of Marcus would have stayed silent. Would have convinced himself it wasn't his place to interfere, would have avoided conflict to preserve family harmony.
The strategic version saw a choice.
He could protect his nephew from inheriting the voice that had haunted him, or he could preserve his own comfort by avoiding difficult conversation. "Jake, come show me this puzzle," Marcus said, settling onto the floor beside his nephew. For the next 20 minutes, he taught Jake something his father had never taught him: how to break complex problems into manageable pieces. How to celebrate small victories within larger challenges.
How to view difficulty as information rather than judgment.
"I got 3 pieces,"
Jake announced, glowing with pride.
"You sure did. What strategy worked best for you?"
"Looking for the colors that match." "Smart approach. What are you going to try next?"
His brother-in-law watched from across the room, clearly uncomfortable with Marcus's approach but unable to articulate why. Later, as Marcus helped clear dishes, his sister pulled him aside.
"That was good, what you did with Jake. Derek means well, but he's intense. Dad was intense too." "Yeah."
She paused, dish towel in her hands.
"Do you ever think about how different we might have been if he'd been more like you are with Jake?" "I think about it all the time. You've changed, you know. Since your promotion, since Elena. You're more yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense.
The weak version of himself had been a reaction to his father's harshness, the opposite extreme, but still defined by that original relationship.
The strategic version was something new entirely.
Not the reaction to his father's weakness disguised as strength, but actual strength built through deliberate practice and conscious choice. That night, driving home from dinner, Marcus realized something profound. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his father's voice criticizing him. Not because the criticism had stopped, but because its opinion had become irrelevant. He'd built a stronger voice, his own voice, that drowned out the echoes of old wounds.
The weak man spends his life arguing with ghosts. The strategic man builds something more interesting than the past's limitations.
2 years later, Marcus stood in front of his bathroom mirror again.
Same cracked tile, same buzzing fluorescent light.
But everything else had changed. The face looking back at him belonged to someone who took up space without apology. Someone who made decisions based on data and principles rather than fear and comfort.
Someone who could disappoint people in service of larger goals. The weak version of himself hadn't died dramatically.
He'd been gradually replaced, cell by cell, choice by choice, moment of strength by moment of strength, until nothing remained but the memory of who Marcus used to be.
His team had become the highest performing department in the company. Not through luck or politics, but through strategic thinking and relentless execution.
They'd attracted talent from across the industry because people wanted to work for someone who made clear decisions and backed them with action.
Elena's firm had grown from 3 employees to 15.
The municipal project had become the flagship example of her approach, generating referrals and recognition that positioned her as a leader in sustainable design. She'd started teaching graduate seminars at the state university, sharing methodologies that were reshaping how the next generation thought about architecture.
But the real measure of transformation wasn't external success. It was internal peace.
Marcus no longer lay awake at night rehearsing conversations, trying to find perfect words that would avoid all conflict.
He no longer analyzed every interaction for signs of disapproval or rejection.
He no longer needed external validation to know his worth. The strategic version of himself had developed something the weak version could never possess: the ability to be disappointed without being devastated, to be criticized without being destroyed, to fail without losing identity.
He'd become anti-fragile. Not unbreakable, that was brittle thinking.
But someone who grew stronger through appropriate stress, who learned faster from setbacks, who could adapt without losing core principles. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he's already done the hardest work. He's taken responsibility for his own transformation instead of waiting for the world to change around him. Rodriguez found Marcus in the gym parking lot after their workout, leaning against his car, looking thoughtful.
"You good, man?" "Yeah. Just thinking about the difference between 2 years ago and now." "What's the biggest change?" Marcus considered the question. 2 years ago, he would have deflected, would have minimized his growth, would have focused on how far he still had to go. 2 years ago, I was afraid of becoming someone people wouldn't like. Now I'm afraid of staying someone I can't respect. Rodriguez nodded.
That's the shift that matters.
When disappointing yourself becomes scarier than disappointing other people.
They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then, Rodriguez asked the question that cut to the heart of everything.
"So what's next?" "You've built the strategic version of yourself. What does he do with the life you've created?" Marcus smiled.
Not the careful, apologetic smile of his former self, but something confident and genuine.
He finds bigger problems to solve. Better ways to serve. Stronger versions of strength.
The weak man thinks transformation has an endpoint, a moment when the work is finished and the person is complete.
The strategic man understands that strength is a practice, not a possession.
That the question isn't whether you've become strong enough, but whether you're committed to choosing strength for the rest of your life. The work never ends.
But neither do the rewards.
Marcus drove home to Elena, to a team that respected his leadership, to a life built on decisions rather than reactions.
To a future shaped by conscious choice rather than unconscious fear.
The weak version of himself was gone, replaced by something more interesting, more capable, more alive.
The strategic man had emerged.
And he was just getting started. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because destruction and construction are different skills entirely. Those who spend their energy trying to diminish you have never learned to build anything worth protecting. But you have. You've built a version of yourself that grows stronger under pressure, learns faster from setbacks, and creates value that can't be stolen or copied. The weak seek safety. The strategic build anti-fragility. The weak avoid difficult conversations. The strategic understand that all progress lives on the other side of discomfort. The weak wait for permission. The strategic take responsibility. The weak make excuses. The strategic make decisions. The weak version of you is not your enemy, it's your raw material. Every moment of cowardice can be transformed into courage. Every pattern of avoidance can become a habit of engagement. Every excuse can be replaced with action. But transformation requires destruction before construction. You cannot build the strategic version of yourself on the foundation of the weak version's assumptions. Those assumptions must be identified, examined, and deliberately replaced. The process is uncomfortable. Growth always is. The results are worth everything it costs to achieve them. Destroy the weak version of you. Build the strategic one. Become the man who cannot be broken by others because he has already done the hardest work on himself. The strategic man waits for no one's permission to exist. He grants it to himself, earns it through action, and defends it through excellence. He is anti-fragile. He is free. He is you, when you choose to claim him.